For Chapter 4, there'll be 2 lectures from me. This one, the first, will focus on cost. We'll talk about opportunity cost, sunk cost, marginal cost, and develop our thinking about that. Once we understand cost well, we'll turn to the second lecture, which is to take that idea of cost and show how it helps us understand how we derive the supply curve. And we'll go through a very similar exercise that we did to the one we did in Chapter 3, where we showed how we got the demand curve. We'll do the same thing this time with the supply curve. So first, let's talk about cost. The thing to understand when we talk about cost, and we talk about cost in the context of supply, is that when we think about supply and we think about people's willingness to supply goods, the basic style of reasoning is the same as demand. People face alternatives, and we have to choose among them based on the marginal benefits and the marginal cost. But when we look at supply, the key is opportunity cost. We've already talked a bit about this idea of opportunity cost, that when we make one choice, the opportunity cost is the next best choice that we give up. That is, if you choose to say, go to your physics class today rather than sleep in, the opportunity cost of going to class is that you gave up sleeping in. If you choose to sleep in instead of going to class, right, the opportunity cost of sleeping in is what you would have learned in class, right? For us to choose to do something, we have to convince ourselves that that choice delivers greater net benefits than the next best option we have. And it's important to understand that when we choose, we're choosing on the basis of our subjective expectations of those 2 alternatives. When you're deciding, should I go to class, should I stay in bed, right? You don't know for sure. It could be the best hour of sleep you ever had, could be an awesome lecture. You just don't know. Your choice is always about your expectation and your subjectively judged expectation about how valuable, about the net benefits of either choice. One way to look at this then is that when we want to induce someone to do something, when we want to persuade someone to do something, we have to overcome their opportunity cost. And this is obvious perhaps in the market. When we want to get someone to buy our product, we have to persuade them to spend their money on our product rather than any other product they might spend on. So when you buy that Starbucks latte for $4, right, what you're saying is I'd rather spend it on this than any of the other things I could spend on. And Starbucks has to make a product that persuades you that it's worth spending on their product rather than the alternatives. And, you know, it's easy to think about this in the context of monetary things in the marketplace, but any choice that we make, this is true, right? To get us to go to class in the morning, right? You have to persuade someone to overcome their opportunity cost, right? And when we think about in terms of money, it's useful to think about this in terms of we have to bid people away from their next best option. You can think about someone who has a job and then gets a job offer from another firm. What does that other firm have to do? They have to bid them away from the first firm. They have to be able to say, I'll pay you more or offer you better benefits or offer you better working conditions, right, for you to come work for me rather than for them. I know what your opportunity cost is. If you don't work for me, you're going to work there. I have to bid you away. I have to overcome that opportunity cost. And what this reminds us is that that cost is ultimately about choice, not about things, right? Things only have cost because those who have the property rights to those things have choices. If I'm deciding between whether to buy the latte or anything else with my funds, with my money, the reason that these things have costs is that I have choices. I can spend $4 on the Starbucks latte. I can go spend it on lunch at McDonald's. I can do all kinds of different things with my $4. The fact that I have choices over my $4 means that there are costs involved. If I do one thing, I give something else up. And it's also important to remember that because choice is individual and contextual, it's us choosing in specific times, in specific places, choices can have different costs to different people. Right? I don't like lattes, right? So for me, that's a very different decision than it might be for you. For some people, taking an economics class is something that they don't want to do or don't like to do. They'll see the choice to take this course differently than you will. So again, notion that choice and that our evaluations of goods and services are subjective is important here too. The other part we have to understand about cost, though, is to remember that it's the marginal choices that matter, right? If you think back to discussion in Chapter 3, we talked about this idea of marginal benefits and marginal cost, that what matters is the next thing in front of us. Is it worth it to do the next thing? What are the benefits? What are the costs? Right? And we talked, in the book, talked a little bit about the water-diamond paradox, and it's not the total value of water or diamonds that matters. It's the marginal value that matters. Well, this is true for costs as well, right? What matters to us when we choose are not the costs we've already incurred, not the costs that happened in the past, but the additional or marginal costs. Let's take the example from the textbook for a minute. Suppose you are going to get married, and you and your spouse-to-be decide to start planning out the wedding, and you find a place that you really want to have the wedding, and you put down a $5,000 non-refundable deposit on that location. So no matter what happens, right, you have to pay the $5,000 to reserve that location, okay? But let's suppose after you make that deposit, you find out that your spouse has been, say, cheating on you, and you decide, I don't want to marry this person, perhaps wisely. What's the cost of canceling the wedding? Is the cost of canceling the wedding the $5,000 for the room, right? And what economists would say is no, actually, that's not a cost of canceling the wedding. Why? Because whether you have the wedding or cancel the wedding, you're out the $5,000. You already spent that. It's done and it's gone. That's irrelevant to the question now. If you think to yourself, should we cancel the wedding? What's it going to cost us to cancel the wedding? It's not $5,000. You're paying that whether you have the wedding or not. The cost of canceling the wedding is what you lose from that point forward as a result of your decision, right? What would you lose? You'd lose the company of family and friends. You'd lose the gifts that they'd bring. You'd lose all the fun that you'd have on that wedding day, presumably if you actually wanted to marry the person. Or imagine, for example, you go to the cafeteria, you buy a sandwich, you taste it, and you pay $5 for it. You taste it, you decide you don't like it, right? You wouldn't, I think, say to yourself, well, I already spent $5 on this. I might as well just go ahead and eat it, right? Why would you, if it's terrible, in fact, if you think it might be spoiled or something, you wouldn't eat it. Now, suppose you can't get your money back on it, right? The decision to continue eating the sandwich or not, the $5 is irrelevant. You're not getting that $5 back. The question is, do you want to risk making yourself sick or not? Or my other favorite example, let's suppose you have an 8 o'clock class in the morning. You wake up at 8:15 and realize you're already late for class. Okay, what do? You could say, well, I'm 15 minutes late already, sort of what's the point? I might as well just blow off the rest. Right, but you're not going to get that 15 minutes back no matter what happens. Whether you go to class or stay home, the fact that you missed 15 minutes is not relevant. The question is it worth it to go for the remaining 35 minutes of class? That's the question, right? Or if it's an hour and a 15-minute class, right, the remaining 60 minutes of class. That's the question. Is it worth it for what it matters going forward? Right? These are what we call sunk costs. These bygones, these costs we've already incurred are sunk costs. When people say there's no crying after spilled milk, right? You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. Those are all different ways of saying bygones are bygones. We can't change the past. Those sunk costs, those things we've already done that we can't change, are economically irrelevant. They're history. They're not an opportunity for future choice. Thus, they're not a cost. Right? If you wake up late for class, the cost of going to class is you're giving up more sleep, or the cost of not going to class is that you're giving up the remaining 35 minutes. The 15 minutes is irrelevant. I don't know if anybody's a poker player, but it's the same thing we see in poker games, right? When we say, don't throw good money after bad. If you've already bet a bunch on a hand, that's irrelevant to whether you think it's worth it to bet more on that hand now. What matters is, what do I want to do right now? You might want to bluff. There's things you can do, right? But the question is, what do I want to do right now? All right. Well, you might think, what does all of this have to do with supply? The key is this. When we think about production and we think about the cost of production, right? Because the decision to supply goods and services is ultimately about, is it worth it, right? What does it cost us to supply these things, and is it worth it? So we have to ask two questions when we think about production. Why did the producer use the particular combination of inputs that he or she did? And why was the monetary cost of that combination of inputs what it was? So why do they do it that way? Remember, there's substitutes for everything. So producers who thought that this was the best way to produce something with this amount of labor and this amount of inputs, right, for physical inputs, thought that was the least costly way to get the job done. But why is that the least costly way? Because ultimately the opportunity costs of the inputs were sufficiently low. So for example, why is labor cheap in India? Because Indian workers have fewer good opportunities than, say, workers in the U.S. Therefore, we get labor-intensive production, right? They have fewer alternatives that they need to be bid away from, so they can be bid away at lower price than we can with, say, labor in the United States. What we pay for a resource depends upon what the owner of that resource can obtain from someone else for that resource, and that depends upon what the other person's what the expected value is that resource can create for someone else, right? So what we bid up for a resource, right, is what we think we can obtain from that resource, which in turn depends upon, right, our expectation of the value that resource could create for someone else. We hire a worker at a certain wage because we think other people could get certain value out of that worker, and we think we'd rather have that value ourselves. What we pay depends upon the value we think that worker could create, right? So the cost of manufacturing of products are the foregone opportunities presented by that set of inputs. So for example, Chinese consumers, think about Chinese consumers. As they start to value their use of cars more highly, that's going to push up the price of oil, right? That's going to increase the demand for oil, and that's going to make air travel in the United States more expensive. Why is that? Well, what they're doing is that Chinese producers, the Chinese consumers, by using more cars and wanting more gasoline, are encouraging Chinese gas producers to bid oil away from other uses. Those other uses might include fueling planes in the United States. Right? And so when we see the supply of gasoline increasing in China, right, because of the increased demand for it by Chinese car owners, right, that has impacts on the supply of other things in the United States. It's not something physical about the oil that drives up the price of air travel, but the idea is that in order to attract oil away from its previous uses, right, that the Chinese producers will have to bid it away from American airlines, and the same is true for the airlines in the United States. If they want to keep flying planes, now they have to bid more for that oil, for the crude oil, to bid it away from Chinese consumers. What makes U.S. air travel more expensive is that the Chinese want more gas for their cars. That is the opportunity cost. Or think about a piece of land, right? What makes land expensive to build a house on? It may be because it's in a good location where lots of other people would like to use that land, say, to build a business or do something else with it, right? What makes something expensive, what affects the supply of a good, is ultimately the demand for it in alternative uses, right? Why is air travel expensive? Air travel is expensive because the fuel is expensive. Why is the fuel expensive? Because the demand for it elsewhere has increased. So one way to think about this is that ultimately supply is demand in disguise. When we see changes in supply, it's because demand elsewhere, the valuation people attach to different goods elsewhere, has changed. At the end of the day, right, what this means is that when we think about supply, what matters is opportunity cost. The marginal costs that suppliers face, that is, the cost they face of making their next decision, are all about the opportunity costs of the different inputs that they're using. The fact that they have to pay more for an input because they have to bid it away from someone else's use is ultimately the marginal cost of production, that is how much more they have to pay to produce, which is linked to the opportunity cost of that resource. What else might people want to do with it? The opportunity cost is what other people or you are giving up. The marginal cost is what you must do, that is, what are the costs you face going forward. So when we think about all of these issues of cost, right, get us thinking about the supply curve. Because what the supply curve ultimately is people thinking about what is the cost of producing this particular good and how much of it will I produce will depend upon the benefits I can get for it in the marketplace compared to the cost of production. And those costs of production, as we'll see in the second lecture, are ultimately opportunity costs.